seems to be a tension between if a parody's too good, that, you know, half the audience, and in fact, that's sort of what satire relies upon, is the idea that some people will buy it and some people won't. So could you talk a little bit more about, in your personal archives, sort of how these people sort of modulate, these artistic producers sort of modulate that, and maybe condition the audience in certain ways to see that?
Yeah, although the type of parodic play that interests me here is that which is crowdsourced, or not deriving from a single source, from an artist or an artistic collective, but rather from people. Of course, there is filtering. The Davis Kopp archive, such as it is, has been collected by, I think, one person. Who knows if all the submissions have been posted and so forth. So there is a kind of organizational consciousness there. But in theory, you're just getting disparate voices. No doubt the person selecting is selecting for comedy, for play, and so forth, and for recognition. But that said, not all there is a particularly inventive or even successful work or act, discursive act, because, well, they fall flat, etc. But that's part of the fun, too. So, yeah, go ahead.
Well, I mean, yeah, because it's also, like, when, in your example from the Berlin, the texting and everything,
right.
you know, and you brought up the counterpublics and everything, and I think that's, you know, definitely, that's like a solid move.
Right.
But, you know, part of it is also the idea of sort of recognizing as yourself as part of a counterpublic, you know, not necessarily in like an oppositional sense, but recognizing yourself in others as, you know, like that you're in that space, and in that space is sort of like some type of rupture or some kind of discontinuity that's happening. And, you know, so that's sort of also what I'm getting at there, that, you know, there seems to be like a little bit of a divide between sort of the producer doing this stuff and you reading the producer versus thinking about the variety of different experiences and sort of how we can think about all of that together.
Right. No, it's true, but I think maybe what one could say about the Urban Diary piece is that the consciousness of oneself as a part of a counterpublic is retroactive, or at least that would be how one would understand it. In other words, that according to Virno, but also I think to Warner, it's about enactment in the particular moment. It's not a given, right? It has to emerge through the actual doing or the being.
This is sort of a half-formed thought, but it's one that I think of every time we talk about these issues and the coming insurrection. It's the we. And I just wonder, I mean, part of me goes, ugh, right? Even though, I mean, I wrote a book on solidarity, it's not like I don't like that. It's just that there's something about solidifying into a we that already seems problematic. I wonder if you could just address.
Of course, I'm not an expert on Anonymous, and if one wanted to study this with any amount of rigor, you'd have to look at Gabriella Kuhlman's work, from which I've learned quite a lot. But what I think we can appreciate about the we in Anonymous is precisely its kind of amorphous, non-fixed quality. It's not clear who's a member. It's not clear what the investments of each of the members are. They're willing to talk about divergent investments. In fact, they're at cross purposes, as is always the case in pirate and hacker and cracker communities. Much of the battle is actually fought against one's fellow hackers and pirates and so forth. So the we there is never, I think, a stable we. And I don't think it suggests homogeneity. I think it certainly allows for a kind of internal variation and so forth, but it does allow for a common purpose, which again differs. You know, there is a break, or many people, anthropologists who study them, talk about a certain break where a faction, so to speak, wants to go more toward the lulls, and another faction is highly energized after Tunisia and Egypt and wants to be more deeply invested in actually existing political movements. So there the we splits, but somehow it's capacious enough, abstract enough to accommodate all of these different purposes, because there's certainly pranking involved in the activities in Egypt and Tunisia, and certainly some of the pranking is deeply committed. Yeah. But you're right, there is this sort of worry about essentializing, about a kind of ontology, about inclusion and exclusion. Is it predicated on disallowing certain voices? I think the Occupy movement has struggled with this quite a lot. the we are the 99%. I mean, I think this is an ongoing battle. I think all that one can ask for is a certain kind of self-consciousness or self-awareness, self-reflexivity, so that you're continuously thinking about who the we includes, especially in the context of something like Occupy. Is the we academic? Is it researchers, theorists? There's always that worry about the divide between theory and practice, people who are actually doing the work, academics who then come in and talk about it and use the collective pronoun we, so I think, again, a kind of constant self-examination, not to the point that it becomes crippling. I mean, obviously one doesn't want to become so self-critical that and self-lacerating that you sort of lose the will to act. But again, I think is maybe all one can do is put it in quotation marks. I do think the we in anonymous is in quotation marks. Yeah.
I always think of
Yeah.
can I sit here? Of a parade, of an anti-war parade I went to in Manhattan, and the crazy divergence of individuals in that march. And I mean, I remember one guy walking through with a sign that said, "Pervs for peace," right? But then there were the business suits. So it was just so radically diverse. But there they were, a we for a moment.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the human microphone in some ways is a kind of enactment or a performance of a solidarity that would be a we, but still recognizing obviously the different voices.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you for a very interesting talk. And I'm definitely enjoyed seeing all the sort of examples you were able to pull together here for discussing this. And I wanted to sort of take it in a slightly different direction by thinking about if we were to sort of historicize this question of tactical media. I mean, I don't know if you would say that this is sort of contingent on certain kinds of technological development that's immediately contemporary to us, or how, say, the 18th century printing practices might involve tactical media involved with like multiple people collaborating on individual projects, or, responses back and forth within a pamphlet war or something like that, if that would qualify, or how you would fit that into this.
Absolutely. Or even could a Greenpeace action be an instance of tactical media? Absolutely. Yeah. Well, I'll speak to the history first. So again, as a kind of institutional entity, it has a very precise history with the Next 5 Minutes festivals in Amsterdam. And Eric Klutenberg and others involved in the tactical media files have done a lot of work to archive that history. So it has a very precise meaning in that sense, even as one wants to say we're not being precise because so much can be classified and tagged in these terms. So yes, in that sense you'd say, well, the usage of tactical media dates from this year, so 18th century, you'd be sort of, But that said, I don't have a particular investment, again, in saying this is or this isn't properly. I think with the historical range, it gets somewhat problematic, because I do think, even though one doesn't want to be determinist and say, you cannot have tactical media without digital media by any means, and there are certainly many practices and projects we can point to that don't, for which computational media is peripheral. It's not axiomatic. It does somehow rely on the kind of posturing or relationship to time that I think digital media makes possible. So I do think one can be pinned down to say that there are ways in which the expansiveness doesn't make sense, and there is a kind of line one would want to draw to say the counter establishment use of a printing press in the 18th century has features or aspects that we might analogize to tactical media, but then one would want to ask why, to what end is, what's at stake in making that kind of cross-historical comparison. Certainly it's not solidarity. I think it's more interesting to think about lateral connections that would enable solidarities, but what would be the purpose in order to legitimate the 18th century practice, or in order to legitimate the present, which is to say there's a deep history, this is not frivolous, but yes, I mean, I do think you could draw genealogy of intervention or counter-establishment movements and so
Counter-public,
forth. But again, then you become so general as to lose anything like a coherent narrative. Yeah.
Okay, well,
But
thank
it's a
you.
good question. I mean, I think that the Greenpeace thing is the harder question to answer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Wouldn't also part of the reason to think back, maybe not as far back as like the 18th century, but to like the Situationists, which it seems to be there's an obvious lineage there, would be, to mark sort of what the different potentialities of the digital media is, and this sort of, especially in considering, I can never say it correctly, détournement or whatever, like the
My French is worse than yours.
yeah, but the reusing, like exactly what this product
Right.
is, and so marking that genealogy precisely to mark a distance and to think about what is entailed in that distance.
Yes, and I think the distance here would be, or rather a difference between the kind of psychosocial, psychosexual enjoyment of the individual and the collective on the other hand. I don't see that same investment in the individual, or one wants not to see the same type of investment. You think, what can we take from the Situationists, what do we not want to take? And I think, in my view, we see more of an investment in community, and I don't know that that's as present with the Situationists. Even as you're thinking about a body politic and so forth, it's still, I think, resolutely about the individual. And pleasures and so forth. And that, pleasure is not left out of tactical media by any means. But I do think there's a slight difference of emphasis. Or maybe you could say that's why you would want to be sort of self-aware of that kind of genealogy, what you were claiming as a legacy, what kind of continuities you wanted to identify, and what kind of discontinuities. And I would think that point of the individual collective would be one way in which you'd want to see a difference or delineate a difference.
Are there any sort of those lineages that are marked by these groups in particular? Because I know that calling something a critical art ensemble versus calling yourself like anonymous and a hacker, like those reference two sort of different but related.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, Critical Art Ensemble is willing to point to different anarchist movements and talk about legacy or genealogy, but always with this sort of like undoing of that legacy and genealogy, even as they will sort of offer it. They'll talk often, or did talk often, I suppose we'll put that in the past tense, of wanting to refuse or some way destabilize historical narratives, which suggests a kind of teleology that they weren't happy with, etc. So it's hard to be stationed before a movement or in relation to a movement that itself wants not to be stationed. Because you're in the odd position of somehow pronouncing upon a thing that wants not to be a stable thing.
Hi. So I just latched on to the word pleasure that you mentioned in this last response, and I'm wondering if you could say something about the kind of pleasure that these sorts of tactical media, what kinds of pleasure it gives rise to, and whether there's an ethics in that pleasure. I'm thinking about pranking in particular, and like maybe internet snarkiness as well. So is that different from like traditional kinds of revolutionary pleasure? Is there a difference there? What do you think about that?
Right, yeah, no, it's a good question. I will say it's a vexed question, and I want to use the Nike plots intervention as an example. Because the documentation from Nike plots, all that I've seen is comical, it's funny, it's pleasurable, but often it's pleasurable at the expense of the people who are being interviewed. So part of the intervention was to poll the passersby, say, what do you think of this? Do you have an opinion on what's happening to Nike plots and so forth? And we're meant to laugh. I mean, that's the sort of optics of the visual narrative. We're meant to laugh at those who say, I think it's great, or I think it's the extension, why not, etc. So the pleasure is there is vexed, right? And what's interesting is it's hard to find in the documentation someone who is aware and is in on the joke at the time. In other words, so the joke can only happen somehow at a remove. At least that's how it's sort of presented, right? That there are those who are duped, and then there are the dupers, etc. This is just all by way of saying, again, it's hard to answer a question about pleasure with any kind of specificity, other than to say that it's not simply about the pleasure of the weak, to use the Sartorian terms, in relation to the strong. in other words, you don't get that kind of easy dialectic.
So, those of us on Twitter, because of course we're always fragmenting our
Right.
conversations out here in the digital humanities world, we've been chatting a little bit about how these practices and these ideas might be put to use in the classroom and what your experience in sort of teaching them has been. Obviously, there's a strong basis in classical feminist pedagogy about accepting failure as part of the process and that kind of thing. But if you could speak a little bit more about how that's been working for you in your spaces, that would be cool.
Yeah. Well, lately, I've been trying to emphasize collaborative composition quite a lot. So in the grad class that I'm co-teaching this term, and the collaborative teaching is part of the point, we're building a scalar book together, and we're sort of thinking about what kind of community might form. We're thinking about what the place is of that type of scholarly practice or mode of knowledge production in the humanities, which so intensely privileges the singular voice, et cetera. That's just what's happening now. In terms of actually activist research, in a way we'd have to turn to Trevor, who's having his students this term do a campaign, essentially, right? Intervene in some way. This is a just quick question. Do you give them just a kind of sandbox? Do you say do something or build something, or do you give very strict instructions?
It's pretty open, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Do they find that intimidating?
Yeah, I think so. Well, I mean, most students are used to being told, okay, this is exactly what you're doing, and when you pull all the training wheels off, a lot of them freeze up.
Right.
So you have to, but I think that's part of the pedagogical process, is getting them to be okay with freedom.
Right. Yeah. So I will be more concrete, sorry, in response to your question. So one thing that I did with undergraduates at a point, when I was teaching a class on, what did I call it actually? Maybe I called it creative cloning. I'd have to go to see what I called it. But one of the things I had students do is precisely this type of exercise that could have been plagiarism in the mode of, is it Jonathan Lethem that has the piece that's every word or every line is a quotation? Is it Lethem? Yeah. Or they could have done something like Nike plots or something. So I also sort of left it as a sandbox, which is to say, give me some type of performance or documentation or performance or an intervention, again, documentation of intervention, in which you enact this idea of critical mimesis. And most of them actually I would say they had fun. We did a little show at the end of the term, and it was one of the more successful exercises that I've done. I'm hesitating because I was almost going to refer you to some of these works. It might be linkable through my website. And with a description of the assignment, actually, so I could send you that if you're interested. Those online could probably search and find it. Yeah. But there too, actually, just back to the sandbox question, pedagogically, one technique that I think is sometimes useful is to actually give instructions and then make the assignment about interpreting the instructions, make it about the execution, and identify then that sort of gap between instruction and execution, or between rules and the actual work, to get them to think about actually where you're going to situate agency, where you're going to situate voice, et cetera. So that they stop asking, what do you want me to do?
I just want to say thank you so much again for coming. We're really, really glad to have you here. You write in the preface of your book that it's sort of trite at this point to talk about how 9/11 affected one's work. However, it seems like your discussion of solidarity and identity, ephemeral as it might be, and anonymous, as well as Anonymous's focus on lulls, may be a part of a series of reactions to 9/11. Could you speak a little bit more about that? Is there a narrative of Anonymous as a reaction to 9/11?
That is actually a fascinating question. I wonder if one could, I mean, usually one would point to the financial collapse or sort of catastrophe of 2008 as the kind of trigger point. There too, one would want to ask, can you really write a narrative that would lead from that, from A to B? I mean, I think one thing that tactical media practitioners would insist upon, and here again I'd say it's always false to make this kind of generalization, but this is one tendency that I see. There is a reluctance to embrace something like a linear causal narrative, which is to say, if we do this, this will result. I don't ever see anyone embrace that sense of linear unfolding. So I would think that one would similarly want to refuse that kind of causality with respect to, again, either 9/11 or 2008. In other words, I see practitioners more investing in the notion of a complex system in which actions reverberate in unexpected ways. Again, retroactively, you could write a narrative that would explain how you get from A to H, but it would be hard to get in this, I don't know. Now I'm speculating, how do you get from 9/11 to
I think writing a narrative would be, anybody could write that fiction, right? If you just
Yeah.
sat around long enough, you would come up with the
Yeah.
ideas for it. But I think more what I'm asking is, do you think that Anonymous's sort of irony in their lulls is a reaction to maybe the solidarity that we all felt after 9/11, as to like, just get this solidarity out of my face because I'm tired of it?
Well, it would be 4chan, right? Yes. And I think it's hard to say that the motivation on 4chan would be so calculated. Right. Yeah. Lulz for lulz sake. I mean.
Unless you're, well, I don't want to use the word, but if you're a new moral 4chan user, right?
Right.
Then it might not be lulz for lulz sake.
Right, right. You know, there's a fascinating lecture viewable online from DEF CON 9, I think. Jason Mitchell, I might be butchering this, no doubt butchering this name, but I can give you the reference later. But it's the history of piracy and basically internecine battles in pirate communities. And it's such a captivating argument because he just so carefully documents that the first crack is always about owning, poning, ragging on your fellow crackers. I mean, in a way, it's only that. And so you see that and you sort of easily see then how 4chan is going to, how it functions in the way that it does, right? Because there's a certain one-on-one upmanship. You always have to sort of prove your mettle, you know, to test your mettle, prove your virtues by defeating your fellow pirates, etc. So counter-solidarity as a response to 9/11. It's interesting to think about it in those terms. Let's talk about that over dinner.
Awesome.
Yeah, unless anyone has ideas about. Yeah,
I'll just say that
yeah,
in that group in particular, ego seems to be the huge thing. It's not just an
Yeah.
antagonist, it's ego.
well, yes, right,
Right.
Yeah.
It's all about me.
right,
Even though I'm not gonna tell you
Yeah.
my name.
right.
Right.
And the name that I give to myself, which is
That's
very
right.
important,
That's right.
right.
Don't forget boredom.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, there probably is a lot to be said about the affective investments of Anonymous and so forth. You'd have to do proper anthropological research, which people are doing, but it's so, this is what's interesting too, it's just so demographically varied and that it's hard. You just, again, have a we. Yeah.
Okay, so this is from one of our RSA chapters.
Uh-huh.
They're asking, do tactical networks have a potential to solidify as more acquiescent or more transgressive? Are they potentially dangerous, i.e., can they potentially be used against tactical networking as a general phenomena?
Okay. So the acquiescence transgression I picked up from Virno, just to make sure that that is properly attributed, that phraseology. In other words, Virno says that social activity is a way to get away from what is inevitably a kind of dialectic. You know, you can either acquiesce or you can resist or transgress. Yeah. Okay, so now that we have attribution out of the way, do you mind just telling me, repeating the question? I want to make sure that I understand.
Okay, so they say, do tactical networks have a potential to solidify as more acquiescent or more transgressive? Are they potentially dangerous, i.e., can they potentially be used against tactical networking as a general phenomena?
Okay, so to that I would say yes, they could be potentially one thing and potentially another. I mean, in as much as you have a stable thing there, there's no ontological or ideological kernel or core. It's not inherently good or inherently bad. Those evaluative terms would only make sense when you were thinking about a particular usage or manifestation or implementation, a particular instantiation. DDoS attacks, I would say, and this is going to go on record, and I'll probably be sorry about it, I don't think DDoS attacks can be so easily dismissed as morally evil, as instances of terrorism, destruction, wanton, destruction, and so forth. DDoS attacks can be used maliciously, but it's the use that I would emphasize. It's not the thing itself. I don't think it's possible to pronounce on the kind of ontological value of something in that way. It doesn't have that kind of core. Yeah. I'm gonna so regret that if I get an email inquiring. I mean, I'm being silly, but you think about all the cases in which artists have been repressed, submitted to state evaluation, not just the transport or immigrant tool, but of course the Steve Kurtz case is the most famous, et cetera. So they are taking real risks, and I think it's important to remember that.
In the preface to your book, you mentioned Hakim Bey, and I think it came from the temporary autonomous zone. And so I was trying to think about sort of what you're talking about here in terms of like the temporary autonomous zone and sort of versus a permanent autonomous zone. But the whole point getting at, like these are spaces created within larger structures that are sort of like super personal, super again ego function going on here all the time, and yet they disperse sort of unwillingly or unwittingly, and then as soon as they disperse, then they're named, and then it's no longer a temporary autonomous zone and whatever. Is there some way that sort of language can sort of help us understand this too? So again, feel free to say yes or no.
Yes, I think what you see. I keep using critical art ensemble because they have the most extensive body of work, but I think you see multiple philosophical, historical, artistic influences, and certainly you can identify language that it seems to be strangely Deleuzian, sometimes not at all Deleuzian. Yes, I do think the temporary, that kind of critical vocabulary has a certain place. I don't think there's any one critical vocabulary that is a better tool, let's say, to use I think the appropriate term for it, than another. I think, again, CAE would always insist it's the tool you need in the particular moment, it's what you have at your disposal, what protocols of the system, what system are you trying to negotiate or navigate, and then what would be the best tools for this particular system. Here you might want the language of the temporary autonomous zone. In another context, you might want a Marxist vocabulary, etc. I think it's all situational.
Sounds super rhetorical.
Yeah, is that a bad thing?
No, just exactly how you're talking about it there.
Right. No, it is. It is,
It just
absolutely.
is, yeah.
No, you're right. Yeah. So can I just end with one thing? There's a tremendously important tactical media practitioner named Beatrice DaCosta, who unfortunately passed away a few months ago. And in the last month, she's been memorialized on the Empire mailing list and so forth. She was very generous with her time and answered a lot of questions for me. I always like to interview and talk to the artists. She was part of a preemptive media collective, and I wrote about one of their projects, Swipe. She was a wonderful human being and just, I think, an amazing artist and had an amazing mind. And I will never probably again have a moment to sort of acknowledge my debt to her, and so that's what I would like to do now. And thank you.